Hello economics students, in this video we're looking at the strengths and the weaknesses of budgetary policy as a tool which Jim Chalmers can reach down and pull out of his toolkit to quote unquote fix the economy, or to technically here affect the level of aggregate demand and achieve our three macroeconomic goals and or impact living standards. Now in this video I'm just going to go through the strengths and weaknesses of budgetary policy, because there is another video on how we can use those strengths and weaknesses to link to the achievement or not achievement of our macroeconomic goals. So firstly, we're thinking about the strengths of budgetary policy as a tool to impact aggregate demand. And I think it's important here to say that it is in comparison to monetary policy. So eventually you'll have to discuss or evaluate or compare the two policy tools, monetary and budgetary policy. And so I think it's important, even though we haven't been through those strengths and weaknesses of monetary policy, to remember we're comparing budgetary policy to monetary. So the first strength of budgetary policy is that it can target areas of weakness. So the budget can, by changing the structure or composition, changing its revenues and expenses, it can target problem areas in the economy or specific industries or specific areas. For example, we could target low or middle income earners. We could target households that are relying on medicines and are affected by high cost of living. We could even target specific businesses in specific areas. Over COVID, maybe areas that were relying on tourism, they could be targeted via budgetary policy. Monetary policy cannot target. It affects the whole economy. So a strength of budgetary policy is it can target areas of weakness in the economy. The second one is that it has a short impact lag, because once the budget or changes have been implemented, they impact the level of aggregate demand relatively quickly, relative to monetary policy, which has a long impact lag. So what that means is that once the policy has been implemented, it influences or changes aggregate demand without delay, or a relatively short impact lag. So for example, if you change the tax system or you change tax brackets, overnight or over a week, households have more money in their account, in their pay packet. Their disposable income increases over a week, right? Or if you're spending more money into the economy through new infrastructure projects, the moment those policies are implemented, the spending takes place and the spending is in the economy. Again, monetary policy has a long impact lag. The third benefit of budgetary policy as a tool is that it has both aggregate demand and aggregate supply impacts. For example, if you're spending on education or infrastructure or research and development, in the short term, these policies are injecting government spending into the circular flow model, and they're going to have aggregate demand impacts. But also in the longer term, they're going to affect the ability and willingness of Australian businesses to produce. And we can think about that when we get to aggregate supply policy. Monetary policy does not have aggregate supply impacts. All right, so what are the weaknesses? So Jim Chalmers looking down at the hammer, the budget in his toolkit, and he's like, all right, well, what's bad about this in influencing the level of aggregate demand? What's not so good about the budget? Well, the first thing, and probably the most important, is that it's subject to political bias or political constraints. The budget, quite simply, is highly politicized. And you might have seen this by looking at the way that the budget is introduced into the House of Parliament. There's a lot of booing and cheering and a lot of jeering and a lot of hear. And, you know, the other side of politics turns their back and all this stuff going on. Now, often too much, the budget is used for political gain rather than economic gain or for sound economic policy. And, you know, you can look back at the history of treasurers in Australia. Not all of them have been trained in economics. We're actually, I suppose, lucky in a way that Jim Chalmers is a highly trained and highly accomplished economist this year, who is our treasurer for 2023. So what happens is that a policy may be passed for political gain rather than economic gain. So during an election, often there'll be more spending into the economy despite maybe some inflationary pressures, or maybe there'll be more tax cuts to certain demographics that might help this particular political party get back into power. And so you've got to think that there's kind of a trade-off between that political party using the budget to win votes, or buy votes and get back into power, and doing what's right for the economy, doing what's right for achieving our three macroeconomic goals. Now, unlike the monetary policy, Budgetary policy is decided on by politicians, so often there's this political bias. Monetary policy is independent of the government or independent of politics. It's also subject, so another weakness of budgetary policy is it's subject to financial constraints, because there is this, again, trade-off between trying to stimulate the economy and spend into the economy or cut taxes, and also the need or the want to bring the budget back to surplus because of the growing level of Australia's public or government debt. And the previous government, the previous Liberal government, had this thing called the medium-term objective. They laid out plans to bring the budget back into surplus and pay down the debt. So there's a trade-off there. You can't just keep spending without any concern for the level of government debt and how that would affect future expenses and the future deficit. Finally, budgetary policy has a long implementation lag. Now, implementation lag is different to impact lag because it's the time it takes to decide on the policy, formulate the policy, and get it implemented, get it through the Houses of Parliament, stamped and ready to actually be implemented. So there's two reasons for this. One is that both Houses of Parliament have to vote, and it has to pass both Houses of Parliament. Sometimes, depending on the political situation, it can get blocked if you don't have a majority, if a government doesn't have a majority. The other reason is that the budget usually takes place once a year in May. There is like a mini budget, an updated budget in December. But unlike monetary policy that meets every single month, it's the first Tuesday of the month right now, and the RBA is about to meet. We have to wait until next year for the new budget. So there is a long implementation lag, a long time for those policies to get formulated for those two reasons. All right, that is the last dot point for budgetary policy. Well done. Let me know if you have any questions, and bye for now.